Using an airbrush to speed paint a batch of miniatures remains the fastest way to accomplish the task. Other great contenders for batch painting a gaggle of minions are base shade highlight painting and slap chop, but even these methods can't compete with the speed of an airbrush. Today I'm going to paint up a batch of Sand Dweller minions for the Cthulhu Death May Die board game. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. I never record myself priming the miniatures that I paint, but I probably should have in this case. I recently purchased dark purple Pro Acryl primer and applied it with an airbrush. It can be brushed on with a standard brush, but I chose to use an airbrush. I'm using this in place of black primer, which I would normally then follow up with a complete coat of dark plum Pro Acryl. This dark purple primer doesn't replicate those results exactly, but it's a fine substitute that gives me a nice dark violet shadow color. I've been unable to find a dark enough purple color amongst the many hobby spray can primers, so dark purple Pro Acryl will be my new go-to violet primer. Now that the primer is dry, I will use the airbrush to layer up some base colors. There are two ways that I thin paint for the airbrush. When using a regular hobby paint, I'll thin it substantially with airbrush thinner. By substantially, I mean that I use 2 to 3 parts paint to 7 to 8 parts thinner. A good way to start is 1 drop of paint for every 3 drops of thinner and then adjust from there. I'll use a couple of drops of flow improver in my airbrush cup as well. If I'm using a thinner paint like airbrush paints or inks, then I'll thin the mix using only a little flow improver. I also like my air compressor set to a fairly low pressure. I typically have it set to 15 psi, which is perfect for well-thinned paints. I spray the model from above at a shallow angle. I'm beginning with a lighter base color for the skin of this model than I would if I were layering up with a standard brush. When layering with a standard brush, I begin with darker paints because each layer of paint usually has a higher opacity than if it were applied through an airbrush. With the airbrush, I'm able to better control the opacity as I build it up quickly over several layers. The outer edge of the airbrush spray on the model will be more transparent. This allows the underlying color to show through, creating a very natural looking transition from the bright mid-tone color to the darker shadow colors below. Next, I jump straight to the ice yellow highlight color. I thin the paint in the exact same way as I did with the ochre brown. I keep my airbrush set to 15 psi or 1 bar. Because this is the final highlight color, I spray the model from above at a much steeper angle than I did with the mid-tone color. Also, since I have the paint so well thinned, I have complete control over the intensity of this color as I build up the opacity. I stop the application of ice yellow before reaching full opacity. I don't want the model to look like it's ice yellow in color. I will add some very small and refined highlights with pure ice yellow and a standard brush later. Looking at the game art, I can see that this creature has some red hues around its eyes, ears, mouth, elbows, and its shoulders. I use crusted sour thinned way down with water to glaze over these areas. A glaze is applied much like a wash, but with a very lightly loaded paintbrush. I want to tint the surface of the miniature with this color, but I don't want it to pool in the recesses like a wash would. An airbrush is great for establishing the base colors for a project. It's also a fantastic way to quickly test out new color schemes without committing too much time to the project. The airbrush is a great way to jumpstart any painting project, but when the airbrush work is done, we still need to rely on a standard brush to refine the details. Even though it isn't reflected in the character art for the Sand Dweller, I decided to add this crusted sour glaze to the hands and knees also. I base coat the Sand Dweller's nose and eyeballs with Death Reaper by Duncan Rhodes 2 thin coats. Necromancer Cloak by the Army Painter would work fantastically here as well, but my supply is running low. The character art shows that this little guy has multiple reflection points within the eyes. Or maybe they're iris features. I'm not sure, but it looks way more interesting than the typical eyeball, so I'm going to follow the game art as closely as possible. I use titanium white to paint 2 to 3 vertical slashes in the upper part of the eye and 1 small horizontal line in the lower part of the eye. To allow for these white reflections to dry completely, I briefly turn my attention to another aspect of the miniature. I'm using ice yellow to color the sand dweller's teeth. I also use the ice yellow to add small, intense highlights to the sand dweller's flesh. Now we can see just how gentle I was when applying the ice yellow through the airbrush. These final highlights of ice yellow are easily visible over the pre-existing ice yellow layer. I use ice yellow through the airbrush to establish the base for these highlights, but it was translucent enough to still allow some of the ochre brown to show through. Finally, we turn to glistening blood to finish off the eyes. Glistening blood is a very transparent effect paint with a gloss finish. It's supposed to be a blood effect, but personally I find it a little too pink to work convincingly as blood. I find it more useful to paint reddish pink features such as mouths or shiny red objects, like the sand dweller's eyes. When I do use glistening blood for, well, blood, I like to mix it with transparent burnt umber ink. This darkens it for a much more realistic blood effect. Well, that wraps up speed painting the sand dwellers for Cthulhu Death May Die. I think they came out pretty darn good for such a quick paint up. I would like to thank my generous channel members for supporting videos like this. You too can become a channel member using the link in the description below, and receive perks such as early access to videos, extended versions of our painting tutorials, and even a tier that lets you choose which miniature I paint next. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.